All right. Tony, can you give me a thumbs up if you see my, okay, excellent. All right, so thank you very much. This is joint work with Diakyanta, who's attending. I hope everybody notices that we are taking this so seriously that we managed to color coordinate our outfits. So we're going to talk about the market for CEOs, and the big picture question that we're trying to answer in this paper is, how does the market for CEOs work, and how well does it work? So let me tell you a little bit about the background and why we decided to write this paper and why we think that we have something to add here. So in terms of why should we care about the market for CEOs and why should we care about CEO and firm matching, there is by now significant empirical evidence, and these studies keep on coming out, that CEOs differ and that CEOs matter for firm performance. And so if we believe this, and I think that there's, again, enough empirical evidence that we should think that this is important, then if CEOs matter for firm performance, then it's also important to have a well-functioning market for CEOs that makes sure that the right CEOs are matched with the right firms. And to kind of guide the discussion a little bit and to get an understanding of what we're after, I want to talk about two recent developments, let's say in the last 10 to 15 years, that have come about in this literature. The first one is the application of models of perfectly competitive and frictionless matching to the market for CEOs. And so this is, if you know Marco Tervio's AER paper, or the Gabex and Landier, I think is a very highly cited paper. And here the idea is that you take models that are well known from, let's say, macro and labor from the end of 70s, early 80s. And in these models, there's the firms and there's the CEOs, and everybody has one characteristic, which is observable. The firms have a characteristic, which is size, and CEOs have a characteristic, which is talent. So you could think of this as total assets and implied ROA. And the idea is that all the firms and all the CEOs can match to anybody, so that everybody is choosing from a unified pool. And what ends up happening in these models is that the largest firm is matched with the most talented CEO, and the second largest firm with the second most talented CEO, and so on and so forth. And an important underlying assumption here is that these traits are complementary. So firm size and CEO talent are complementary, which is to say that a very talented CEO can make a larger difference in terms of dollar gains generated in a large firm as they can in a small firm. And the point of applying these models to the CEO labor market, if you think about Gabex and Landier, is what they're saying is, look, if skill and firm size are complementary, which is a very reasonable assumption, and if firm size has grown over time, let's say since the 80s and over the past, let's say 30, 40 years, then this can potentially provide an efficient reason, an efficient argument for why CEO pay has risen over time, is because firm size has risen over time. The second and kind of parallel development in this literature is the idea that there has been an increased demand for general managerial skills. And here, just to give you a definition, the idea is general managerial skills are skills of the CEO that are portable across firms, and firm-specific skills are skills that are not portable across firms. And what people have shown in this literature is they've argued theoretically that if the demand for general managerial skills, general managerial human capital has been increasing, then this can also potentially serve as an explanation for why we see an increase in CEO pay. Now, this is a little bit trickier because you need to take into consideration both that CEOs' outside options are better, but also the firm's outside options may be better. So maybe there's also a supply effect, that the supply of general managerial skills is also increasing. There's more CEOs out there who have worked at multiple firms. There's more CEOs with an MBA. But the bottom line is that the reason that this has been gaining ground is because an increased demand for general managerial skills can also provide an explanation, and can also provide an efficient explanation for why CEO pay has gone up over time. So what we're trying to do in this paper is we're trying to say, look, clearly these are valid forces that have come about in the last, let's say, 30 years. And clearly these are things that we need to think about. What we want to do is we want to conduct an empirical examination of where things stand right now in the CEO labor market. And what we're going to do is we conduct this empirical analysis of the CEO labor market. And as we do that, we're going to try to shed some light with our empirical analysis on the predictions from these models and on the predictions of some other models also. So what we actually do in the paper is we're going to document CEO hiring patterns in terms of the CEO's prior connections to the hiring firm, in terms of whether they were raided from another firm. So raided in this literature is another word for poaching or job hopping, which means that you move from, let's say, a CEO position at one firm to a CEO position at another firm, and the reason that you move was the job offer that you got from the other firm. We're also going to look at differences in hiring choices across firms. So firms in different situations may decide differently. And finally, we're also going to look at whether there are differences in the cost of these CEOs, whether differences in CEO pay can explain some of this. Now, the sample for our investigation is going to be the S&P 500. So we're going to look at all new CEO hires in the S&P 500 from 93 to 2012. There's a number of reasons that we do this. And the first one is that arguably, these are the firms that face the lowest frictions, the least severe frictions. So you can think of that as they have in-house HR departments. They also have the resources to reach out to executive search firms. So arguably, these are closest to the frictionless ideal. And also, these firms, given that they're very large, arguably if any firm, and they're very complex also, if any firm has a large demand for general managerial skills, these firms should have a requirement that they need for CEOs with general skills, which means that you think about the models that I talked about on the previous slide. By looking at CEO hires in the S&P 500, we're arguably trying to look at a sample where these models may have the most bias. The setting is the closest to the competitive and frictionless ideal that the models have in mind. All right, so let me give you a rundown of the main results. So the first set of results is simply on inside versus outside, insiders versus outsiders. So the punchline here is going to be that most new CEOs, one way or another, are kind of sort of insiders. They have prior connections to the hiring firm. So breaking that down in 3 layers, the first layer is that 72% of CEOs are promoted internally. This is something that has been documented in prior literature. So this is something this is a number that we measure in our sample. This is similar to what has been documented, although somewhat lower than what has been documented in prior literature. Then the second layer is that when you start kind of looking a bit more closely at these external appointments, what you find is that even among the external appointments, a lot of people are actually former executives or current or former board members. So 8.4% of new CEOs appointed in the S&P 500 are former executives of the firm. So they rehire somebody that used to work there before, or they're current board members, mostly current board members. Some of them are former board members. So this now, if you add 72% to this 8.4, this leaves about 20% of CEOs who are truly outsiders that we're going to be calling outsiders. But then we kind of got a little bit suspicious and we said, well, maybe these outsiders also have some shades of gray. And what we find is that indeed, even among the remaining 20% who are outsiders, 54% actually have a connection to the board of the hiring firm because they've crossed paths professionally with somebody who's on the board of the hiring firm. And here, establishing a reasonable baseline is important. You might be worried that within the S&P 500, everybody knows everybody, right? This is a small profession. Everybody's just aware of who the main players are. So then what we do is we conduct a placebo test where we conduct a control group of CEOs hired by similar firms around the same time in the same industries. And there we find that it's only 3% of these new CEOs that have the same the board connection is previously defined. So against this benchmark of 3%, the 54% connectedness seems quite large. So then if you add this 80% to the 54% of the remaining 20, what happens is that 90% of the time, new CEOs are appointed from the pool of candidates that are already known to at least one member of the board of directors. So either because they're inside promotions or former executives or current board members or co-workers of the directors. Then the second question, having established that most of these CEO appointments are insiders, then we say, okay, well, where do these firms find the outsider hires? And the first result here, and again, convenient punchline, is that only 3.2% of all new CEOs move with immediate effect from a different CEO position at another firm. So we call these CEO raids. And this is surprising because this is what should be happening in a sense in the frictionless matching model. So you can move from being a CEO of a smaller firm. Once people figure out that you're really great, you can move to being a CEO of a larger firm. This is not really what's happening in the data. 3 out of 100 cases is the relative proportion. What is instead happening is if we look at the 20% of the outside hires, most of these outside hires are actually below CEO execs of other firms. So that accounts for 55% of the 20% outside hires. And 31% are actually what we call free agents. Free agents in our definition is people who have no apparent employment at the time that they're appointed to the CEO role. So it could be that somebody is de facto unemployed. This includes things like they have a couple of independent directorships, but no full-time employment. This could include something like myself. Let's say if I start at Cziraki Consulting Enterprises and I'm the founder and CEO of Cziraki Consulting Enterprises, which means that I started a business I want to keep active, but really I'm sort of looking for my next gig. So this is our definition of free agents. Now, determinants of hiring choices differ across firms. The most important result here, I think, is that larger firms see even more internal promotions and they hire fewer outsiders. And again, this is surprising if what you have at the back of your mind is a model in which for large firms, it's really important to seek general CEO talent, because if firm size and general managerial skills are complementary, it is precisely these large firms who should be very, very bent on finding the most talented CEO. And we also find that after a bad firm performance, firms are more likely to hire both outsiders and former execs. But even for these poorly performing firms, the modal choice remains the insider. And finally, let's look at some of the results on CEO pay. Differences in new CEO pay, this is kind of what you would expect. Outsiders are more expensive than internal promotions. Any reasonable model of the CEO labor market would give you this result. So you could think, well, this is because general managerial human capital is priced. You could think, well, because these people have better outside options. Or you could think, well, because you need to compensate them for moving frictions. However, the point that we want to make here is that these differences in CEO compensation are rather small. So they amount to about $2 million per year in terms of total compensation. And again, this is surprising if you think that these are very large firms. The CEO can add a lot of value. These firms could afford to pay them much more based on how large they are, which means that it is true that there are differences in CEO pay, but these differences in CEO pay alone cannot be the only explanation for the hiring patterns that we see in the data. So where does that leave us in terms of how the CEO market functions and what we think about the validity of the model? The first point that we make is that the market is not really described very well by fully competitive assignment models in which firms choose from a unified pool. Instead, what seems to be happening is that the candidate pool is different across firms and is a much smaller subset of the overall market. Every firm is choosing from a much smaller set than the overall market. In order to match the data, what we would need instead is a model where firm-specific human capital is important, or a model where asymmetric information or some combination of these two are important, because firms seem to exhibit a strong preference for hiring their current or former employees or their current or former board members. And on the asymmetric information side, this would explain why you might be hiring connected outsiders. So people who have not worked for the firm before, but at least know some of the directors. Either it is the case that the directors want to know the candidate, or the incoming candidate wants to know the board of directors, vice versa. And finally, and this is the most tentative part, so this is a conclusion that we're still thinking about, is that maybe one of the reasons that we have seen this increase in pay is simply because the importance of firm-specific human capital now means that there's only a few people that know how to run a large firm like GE. Most of these people happen to be working for GE. And given that there's only few people, there's some rents, which could be shares, and that these are increasing in firm size. This is a very tentative implication, so we understand that we need to think more about the supply and the demand, but this probably seems to be more supported by our data than the narrative that CEO compensation is going up because of the importance of general human capital. All right, so let me now explain all of these things in more detail. So we start out by looking at all new CEO appointments by S&P 500 firms during 93 to 2012. There are 1,358 new CEOs. We discard 129 interim appointments, where our definition here follows Kramer's and Greenstein's paper. So you're an interim appointment if you have served for less than 12 months. We have played around with this threshold. This leaves us with 1,256 CEO appointment events. And so for the internal appointments, we chalk them up as internal. For the external appointments, we go into great detail and hand collect their employment history, including directorships. And we also we then cross-reference their history of employment and directorships to the employment history of the people who are on the board of the hiring firm at the time of the appointment to see whether whether they have overlapped with this person previously. And so our first set of results now in more detail is going to be this insiders versus outsiders distinction. So once we look at this 1,256 non-interim new CEO appointments, what we find, and this is the headline number that I gave you earlier over here, is that 72% of people are internal promotions. This means that you used to be the COO and president of the firm, and now you're promoted to the role of CEO. And 28% are external hires. But once we go in more detail into the external hires, what we find is that a lot of these external hires were actually former executives of the firm, current or former board members, mostly current board members, but some of them were former, or they were both. So what that leaves us over here on the right side, you see this number 19.6%. This is what I keep on rounding up to 20%. 20% of new CEO appointments are really outside to the firm, are really outsiders to the firm. Now, what happens when we stratify this by large firms versus small firms? Remember that large firms should be more bent on finding more general CEO talent. When we look at this, in fact, at large firms, you can see that large firms do even more internal promotions, and they have even less outsiders. So now it's only 17% outsiders. So this is, remember that this is larger firms within the S&P 500. The smaller firms within the S&P 500 do less internal promotions, and they actually end up with more outsider hires. Another thing that has been prominent in the literature is that the fraction or the percentage of outsiders appointed is increasing over time, and the percentage of internal hires is going down over time. Is this true in our data? Let's have a look. Once we split up our sample into about 6 to 7 year subsamples, what we find is that in the first part of the data, 74% internal promotions, 19% outsiders. Second 7 years, we see that internal promotions decline. But then what we see in the last 6 years of the data, and we could split this into 5 or 10 year or whatever, the patterns are roughly the same. There's not really much in terms of internal promotions going down. Yes, they go down in the middle of the sample, but then they come back up to 74%. This is fairly stable during our sample period. So maybe it is true what the prior studies document, surely that the fraction of internal promotions is going down. However, this trend seems to have stopped during our sample period. Okay, so then now let's look at the outsiders. So the first thing that we document is that even the outsiders are connected to the board of the hiring firm. So what we do is we cross-reference our CEO data with BoardX. And I want to be open that we cannot find all of our CEOs in BoardX. So this is conditional on being able to match a CEO to BoardX. Most of these non-matches come from the pre-2000 observations. So this is going to be more heavily tilted towards the second part of the sample. So what we find is that of the 123 CEOs that we can match to BoardX, 66 have a connection to the board of the hiring firm. And here by connections, we mean professional connections. So we say that, have you worked together with somebody that's on the board of the hiring firm, or have you been an independent director on the same board as somebody that's on the board of the hiring firm? We don't do any educational ties or golf club memberships and these things. So it's just the professional connections, 54%. And here you might be wondering, well, maybe there's these small industry networks. Everybody knows everybody. Maybe if people don't know you, it just means that your quality is low, you're not prominent enough. So to try to get at that, what we do is we try to match each of the focal CEOs, so the ones on the left over here, to somebody that has been hired by a firm of a similar size within the S&P, even within the S&P 500 of similar size, in a similar industry within plus or minus 1 year of the appointment of the focal CEO. And so here we find that of these matched CEOs who are quite similar in terms of the industry, in terms of the firm size, and in terms of the timing of the appointment, only 3% are connected to the board of the hiring firm. And so we think that there is a good case here to claim that there seems to be a large propensity of firms to appoint somebody that is connected to one of the board members of the hiring firm. All right, so what this means is that when you add this 54% of the remaining 20%, right? More than 90% of new CEOs are from the firm's current employees, former employees, board members, or former co-workers of its directors, which suggests that firm-specific human capital and asymmetric information play an important role in this market. All right, now, where do these firms find the outsiders? So when we break this down, so remember here at the top, we have the 20% of outsiders. So now we're going to break this down. 2.8% are rated CEOs, meaning that they were hired away with immediate effect from the CEO position at another firm. 10.7%, so actually most of them are rated other executives. So you were a divisional CEO, you were a COO, you were president of another firm, and you were hired away to become the CEO of the focal firm. And then 6.1% of these outsiders are free agents, which means that, as I explained, they have no apparent employment at the time. Maybe they're self-employed at their own, maybe small-scale firm, or maybe they have a couple of independent directorships. Now, we can also look at what we call the external insiders. So remember, these are the people who are former employees of the firm or former board members and so on and so forth. Now, the punchline here is most of these are free agents. So if you look at this 8.4%, thank you, Tony, 10 minutes remaining. If you look at this 8.4%, most of these are free agents. So most of these have no apparent employment. And indeed, when you look at this in more detail and try to find a bit more context, these are typically former employees, maybe former CEOs who are retired. Some of them are actually on tropical islands. So there's one story when the person was, I think, of retirement age, and they were literally living on the Bahamas or in Bermuda. And then they came out of retirement to go back to their own firm. So this is very typical in this subset. And I want to highlight that the 3.2% number that I gave you in the introductory slides comes from this. So you sum the 0.4% to the 2.8%, only 3.2% of the overall set of these new CEOs are rated from CEO positions at other firms, which is kind of suggests that there is very little reallocation of CEO talent across firms. All right. Now, let's look at the differences in where these people are hired from, once again, to get a sense of what this market looks like and what the pool may look like. So when you look at the rated other executives here on the left or the rated CEOs here on the right, what we find is that by and large, this is a US market, and by and large, it's the US public firm market. So if you look at rated CEOs, most of them, 80%, come from public US firms. Rated other execs, once again, close to 80%, come from US public firms. And the remainder mostly come from US private firms. Very few rates happening from foreign public firms or for foreign private firms. Now, what's interesting is there's a stark contrast when you look at rated other executives here in the middle versus rated CEOs in terms of the firms that they come from in terms of size. Rated other executives come from very large firms. Rated CEOs come from very small firms. And perhaps the most useful comparison is when you look at the ratio of the origin to destination firm, because this has a very obvious interpretation. So if you look at these numbers, what this suggests is that rated other executives, and so the number to the left here is the mean and the number to the right is the median. Let's focus on the median. At the median, when you're hiring away the non-CEO exec of another firm, you're hiring away the non-CEO level exec of a firm that at the median is 4 times your size, on average is 10 times your size, much larger firm. And when you're rating a CEO, you're typically hiring away the CEO of a significantly smaller firm. So the size ratio is 1/3 to 1/4 here at the median. So these are typically the CEO rates versus the non-CEO rates have this very different pattern in terms of relative firm size. Now, let's now look at the characteristics of the hiring firm. So in what position are these firms that make different hiring choices? So let's focus on 2 things: firm size and past performance. So in terms of firm size, internal promotions are typically done by the largest firms relatively in the sample, whereas true outsiders, so people with no prior ties to the firm, are typically appointed by the smallest, relatively speaking, firms in the sample. This is true both on average at the median. And the other thing that happens is what I call you could think of this as like a bit of a U-shaped pattern. So what happens is, whether you appoint an insider or not is kind of a U-shaped function of previous firm performance. So let me unpack that a little bit. When you look at internal promotions, it seems like these are industry adjusted returns. So it seems like you're basically performing in line with your industry. At the median, there's no difference. And it also seems like your departing CEO is relatively older. They're closer to retirement age, and that they have served basically what seems to be the average or the median tenure of a CEO in general, median 7 years, average nine years. This looks an awful lot like a planned transition. So you promote the internal person when things are going as expected. Now, what happens is that if you look at the true outsiders here on the right-hand side, so these are the people who have no firm-specific human capital. These firms, thank you, Tony, 5 minutes. These firms typically have poor performance, and their CEOs are relatively younger, and they have served much fewer years. But what I mean by the U shape is that in the middle, you get this external insider. So these are people who are hired from the outside, but they're typically rehires of former execs. So they have some degree of familiarity with the firm. And these are really the firms that are in dire straits. So if you look at the performance, their performance is both on average and at the median is very, very bad relative to the industry. Their departing CEOs are young, relatively speaking, and they have served at the median 3.5 years. This looks like forced turnover, and things are really not looking good. So on the one hand, you want to communicate to the market that you're not just promoting somebody internally, but on the other hand, you do want to hire somebody who's familiar with the firm and can sort of hit the ground running. All right, now, the other way of looking at this by way of graphs, you can split by quintiles of these measures. So let's look at this 83% number here. What this means is that in the firms that are in the top quintile of market value, 83% are internal promotions. Then you get this gray area of external insiders, and then you get 9% outsiders. What I want you to take away from the graph, the intuition is the same as before. Larger firms do more internal promotions, and firms that have had poor performance are the ones that do more external hiring. But what I want you to take away, the other thing I want you to take away from this graph is most of the time, all of these, the large bars are always internal promotions. Even firms that have been experiencing bad past performance, that the departing CEO age looks like they're young, it looks like their CEO has served a shorter tenure. Even these firms, the modal choice is still the internal promotion. All right, now let's look at the sources of outsiders, and let's try to understand, let's look at the differences between outsider hires and what situations the firms were in. So here we can talk a little bit, and I think Leah and also the Slack discussion prior to the presentation, people have said that looking at the supply is important. And I think here we can, in the paper and also here in the presentation, I can point out that this is something where we look at a supply side argument. So what you see here is rated CEOs CEO raids are typically what is done by larger firms. Free agents are hired by relatively smaller firms. And again, if you look at the performance story, what seems to be happening here is rated CEOs are not only hired by larger firms relatively, but also by firms that, relatively speaking, yes, they underperform, but not as badly as these other two categories. So if you put these two together, from the perspective of the rated CEO, you can become the CEO of a larger firm, and you can also become the CEO of a firm, 2 minutes, you can also become the CEO of a firm that is relatively not performing as poorly, which suggests that this has to do with your outside options. So the free agents, on the other hand, they have relatively less good outside options, so they would take a deal by a smaller firm that is performing much more poorly. All right, finally, I promised to talk about new CEO pay, so let's look at that. So we can break this out, insider, outsider. So by partial year, over here in the top row, we mean the first year that the CEO is appointed that is not a full fiscal year. And so here you see larger differences in abnormal compensation. Abnormal compensation comes from regression, where we regress CEO pay on industry fixed effects, firm size, and the interaction of these two things. And so what you see is that, yes, the partial year features higher compensation, but probably this is a one-off bonus to offset moving expenses and to overcome some frictions. But once things settle into steady state, the first full fiscal year, these differences are no larger than 2 million. And even when we split it up by the source of outside hire, we once again, we see that these differences in the first full year are no larger than 2 million. This is surprising if you think that these firms are very large, and they could certainly, given their size, pay the CEO more than 2 million in excess of whatever the going rate is. Okay, now I also have some regressions. I won't have time to discuss them, so let me just move to the conclusion. I just wanted to highlight these because I want the audience to understand that I'm sometimes capable of running OLS regressions. Let me conclude since I'm short on time. Okay, so what we document in this paper is that, by and large, in this set of S&P 500 firms from 93 to 2012, these firms hire CEOs that they're already familiar with, which is surprising because they have access to executive search consultants. So there's nothing really preventing them from venturing out and exploring the larger pool. And there seems to be little reallocation of CEOs across firms. Remember that the proportion of CEO rates is 3.2%. What to us this suggests is that firm-specific human capital and personal contacts are very important when understanding this market. So we should probably be moving towards models that feature firm-specific human capital and models that feature asymmetric, the importance of mitigating asymmetric information. The effective hiring pool is different across firms and is actually relatively a lot smaller than the overall set of CEOs. And perhaps, again, this is the most speculative implication that we're going to put out there, perhaps the rise in CEO pay in recent years could be explained by CEOs sharing increasing rents from their firm-specific human capital as opposed to general human capital. Thank you very much. This is the end. I look forward to the discussion.